Ever the lover of paradox, Rousseau wrote in the Discourse on Inequality that a state of reflection is a state contrary to nature, and a thinking man is a depraved animal. How then, or in what sense, can Rousseau be a philosopher? In dozens of articles, in 2 path-breaking books, Rousseau's exemplary life, The Confessions as Political Philosophy, and Rousseau as author, Consecrating One's Life to the Truth, Christopher Kelly has deepened enormously our understanding of this most vexed of questions and has shown us why we should understand it if we were to understand ourselves and our age. Professor Kelly currently teaches at Boston College and has taught at the University of Toronto, Yale, Georgetown, Dartmouth, the University of Maryland, and the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris. He is the co-editor of the 12-volume collected works of Rousseau in English, published by the University Press of New England, the most authoritative edition of Rousseau available in the English language. Professor Kelly stands in the first ranks of the international and hotly contested world of Rousseau studies for some very good reasons. Anyone familiar with his scholarship soon realizes that he has read practically everything Rousseau wrote, as well as, it seems, everything written about Rousseau by others. Does he sleep? Combining this disciplined and wide-ranging scholarship with considerable philosophic acumen, Professor Kelly's work opens up new vistas on Rousseau's thought. I taught a precept on the Confessions a few years ago and found his commentary illuminating and invaluable. Please give him a warm welcome.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be at St. John's College, an institution that I admire very much. The fact that you've invited me to speak at this particular time on this specific subject says something about what makes St. John's a distinctive institution. Last year was the 300th anniversary of Rousseau's birth and the 250th anniversary of the publication of both Emile and On the Social Contract, 2 of his most important books. Because of these anniversaries, conferences and lectures on Rousseau were very much in fashion last year. The fact that you've invited me to speak here in a non-anniversary year shows that St. John's doesn't need a special occasion to take an interest in Rousseau, and that it doesn't feel obliged to follow fashion. On one occasion last year, I was invited to give a lecture, and my host suggested that I talk about something I'd been working on recently. I mentioned that I was studying Rousseau's writings on chemistry. My host quickly said he would leave the topic to me, but strongly hinted that the audience he hoped to lure to the lecture would probably be very small if I insisted on talking about chemistry. Wanting to be a good guest, I found another topic. St. John's imposed no such limit, and indeed, Jonathan specifically asked me to talk about Rousseau's chemical writings. I'm grateful for the chance to profit from this difference between St. John's and other colleges by engaging in discussion with you about this subject. I should begin by saying a little about the place chemistry holds in Rousseau's career as a writer and the reasons I'm interested in it. I understand that most of you are familiar with Rousseau's Discourse on the Origin of Inequality. I'll conclude with a reference to an important part of the argument of the discourse so you can see the bearing of chemistry, or at least Rousseau's studying of chemistry, on what you've been studying. I can see to begin with that there is little in the discourse, or indeed in any of Rousseau's major works, that would lead one immediately to believe that he had a great interest in chemistry. His most conspicuous references are very critical. He presents it as an unhealthy and boring pursuit that leads its adherents to think that they know more than they do, and encourages the lamentable tendency of teachers to lord over their students. There are less conspicuous passages, however, that reveal that he knew a good deal about chemistry. One occurs in the second discourse. If a student came to me and said, "I'm in a seminar that's discussing the second discourse in 30 minutes and I haven't looked at it yet. What should I read to get some sense of the work?" Of course, I'd spend the first 10 minutes lecturing the student about the importance of keeping up with one's work. If I took pity, I would then mention the 9th of Rousseau's Notes, in which he discusses the common perception that human life is miserable and shows that this perception is based not on nature, but on a social experience of misery that is susceptible to change. This might be the most characteristic passage in all of Rousseau's works. In discussing how social life contributes to our ills, Rousseau refers to unhealthy trades which shorten lives or destroy the physique. These trades include preparation of metals and minerals such as lead, copper, and arsenic. These metals happen to receive detailed attention in Rousseau's chemical writings. He gives an elaborate account of arsenic mines that forms the background for his passage in the discourse. When describing a mine that yields an unusually corrosive arsenic prized by chemists, he says, "All those who labor there are malefactors condemned to death, and who ought to regard a life prolonged for such a short time and destined to such a sad use rather as a torture than as a benefit. The sight of these wretches causes horror. They resemble specters rather than men. Dried out like skeletons, they finally perish in this frightful abode, which appears destined only for the destruction of nature." So Rousseau's brief reference to metals in the second discourse is based on some knowledge of his subject. When he published the second discourse in 1755, Rousseau was already very famous. In 1750, he had won a prize for his Discourse on the Sciences and the Arts, a work which called into question the moral benefits of learning and stirred up a very lively controversy throughout Europe. 2 years later, he composed an opera that became the most popular opera of the century in France. His career as a publishing writer lasted only another dozen years. Scholars sometimes talk about Rousseau's early writings and his later ones. By the former, they mean primarily the first and second discourses, and by the latter, the social contract and Emile. This framework has its uses, but it can be misleading. As I said, Rousseau wrote all of these works over a very short period of time. He often worked at several at a time, some of which he published right away and others which he took more time to finish. Why is a work published in 1755 an early work, and one begun earlier but published a few years later a late work? He himself always insisted that these writings form a unified whole. Furthermore, calling the discourses early works neglects the fact that Rousseau was 38 when he published the first of these. Calling the discourses early writings turns our attention away from anything that came even earlier. Rousseau himself contributes to this tendency. He often referred to the first discourse as a turning point in his life. In describing the period before the discourse, he says, "I was active because I was foolish. To the extent that I was undeceived, I changed tastes, attachments, projects, and in all these changes I always wasted my effort and my time because I was always looking for what did not exist." I once heard a prominent scholar begin a talk on Rousseau by saying that for the first 38 years of his life, he was essentially a bum. It's not easy to dispute this claim. He had no accomplishments, no steady source of income, and led a very checkered personal life. Everything changed in 1749 when he saw an advertisement for an essay question: "Has the restoration of the sciences and the arts tended to purify morals?" Rousseau described his reaction to this advertisement this way: "If anything has ever resembled a sudden inspiration, it is the motion that was caused in me by that reading. Suddenly I felt my mind dazzled by 1,000 lights. Crowds of lively ideas presented themselves at the same time with a strength and confusion that threw me into an inexpressible perturbation. I felt my head seized by a dizziness similar to drunkenness. A violent palpitation oppressed me, made me sick to my stomach. Not being able to breathe anymore while walking, I let myself fall under one of the trees of the avenue, and I passed a half hour there in such an agitation that when I got up again, I noticed the whole front of my coat soaked with my tears without having felt that I shed them. Everything that I was able to retain of these crowds of great truths which illuminated me under that tree in a quarter of an hour has been weakly scattered about in my three principal writings, namely that first discourse, the one on inequality, and the treatise on education, which three works are inseparable and together form the same whole." In another description, he says, "At the moment of that reading, I saw another universe and I became another man." It's not surprising that such remarkable passages would lead people to the view of Rousseau's life in which the first part was one of total confusion and the second was one of extreme clarity. While the details of Rousseau's youth might be interesting, such people conclude, when we consider him as a serious thinker, he was in effect born in October of 1749. There is, however, something unsatisfying about this commonly accepted picture. Rousseau says that before the Illumination, he had been wasting his time in a series of different projects. He does not, however, say that he had not had a single thought in his head. He indicates confusion, not total ignorance. Looking at the Illumination as a beginning point, which it surely was in some sense, obscures the fact that it was also a conclusion. A period of confusion came to a close and was replaced with clarity. While few people have had an experience comparable to the one Rousseau reports, small versions of it are not rare. One can be working on a proof from Euclid, for example, and be completely at sea until the moment at which the solution suddenly becomes clear. In such experiences, we might be tempted to say that we had been wasting our time prior to the moment of insight, but we've nonetheless been searching for something, and had we not been searching, we would not have had the insight. This sort of consideration has led me to look into Rousseau's projects before the Illumination. It's not that I'm searching for influences, as if his thought is simply the resultant of some external forces. I'm also not particularly interested in the question of the persistence of opinions he held when he was 12 years old. What does interest me is to identify the questions that preoccupied Rousseau just before the Illumination. This is where his writings on chemistry come in. From the conventional view, we would not guess that in the years leading up to the 25-page-long first discourse, Rousseau wrote a manuscript called Chemical Instructions, which is over 1,200 pages long. 1,208, exactly. Indeed, this is only one part of several thousand pages that Rousseau wrote during this period on 3 research projects that engaged his attention. I mentioned the scholar that said that prior to the Illumination, Rousseau essentially passed his life as a bum. I myself would prefer to say that he passed his life like a St. John's student. I can tell you're asking, what's the distinction? From the time he was in his early 20s, not much older than the typical student, Rousseau set out to educate himself by reading great books. In his autobiography, he describes how he passed a typical day. After breakfast, he studied philosophy, especially Locke, Leibniz, and Descartes, but others as well. From philosophy, he turned to geometry and calculus. Then he turned to Latin. After a lunch spent in conversation, he turned to more leisurely studies, which included history, geography, astronomy, music, and literature. I know this is not precisely your curriculum, but it resembles it more than it resembles that of most other American colleges. Rousseau did differ from the St. John's student in that he educated himself largely alone, and usually without any tutor or other students to help him. When he was 23, he wrote to his father, "I have made for myself a system of studies that I have divided into 2 principal headings. The first covers everything that serves to enlighten the mind and to adorn it with useful and pleasant knowledge, and the other contains the means for forming the heart for wisdom and for virtue." He concluded, "It is not to be feared that my taste will change. Study has a charm that makes it so that once one has tasted it, one can no longer detach oneself from it." He never did waver in this attachment. This shows as clearly as one could wish that from a fairly early time, Rousseau was engrossed in questions of philosophic and moral importance. He might have been confused, but he was engaged in serious thought. I did not mention chemistry among Rousseau's studies at this period. He did, in fact, dabble a little in it. For many young people, the principal attractions of chemistry involved magic tricks and blowing things up. Rousseau was no exception. Rousseau reports attempting to manufacture invisible ink for a magic trick and having the experiment blow up in his face, almost killing him and leaving him blind for 6 weeks. This experience taught him not to meddle in such things until he acquired more basic knowledge. He acquired this knowledge and wrote his manuscript on chemistry in the next decade. Rousseau arrived in Paris in 1742, 30 years old, filled with hopes for success based on a theoretical work on musical notation and a play he had written. When these were not warmly received, he was left with the resource of some letters of recommendation, one of which was to a Jesuit priest, who advised him to turn away from scholars and academies in his pursuit of success, saying, "One does nothing in Paris except by means of women. They are like the curves, of which wise men are the asymptotes. They ceaselessly approach them, but they never touch them." He obtained entry for Rousseau into a few households, including that of Louise Marie Madeleine Dupin, whose stepson was slightly younger than Rousseau. The young men formed a friendship, and in the spring of 1743, they took a course in chemistry with Guillaume François Rouelle, the leading French chemist of his day, and later a teacher of Lavoisier, among others. The Dupin family offered Rousseau a position as a research assistant on their various projects, including works on economics, a history of the political and moral influence of women, and chemistry. Rousseau accepted the offer because he was desperate for a steady income. His contribution to each of these projects is worthy of attention, but let's stick to chemistry. I'll be happy to talk to others later if anyone cares to ask about them. Rousseau explains that the stepson was studying natural history and chemistry at that time and was making a collection. "I believe that he aspired to the Academy of Sciences. For that purpose, he wanted to write a book, and he judged that I could be useful to him in this labor." In other words, Rousseau would write the book, and the stepson would get the credit. They continued their studies with Rouelle and took several of his courses over a period of years. At the beautiful chateau of Chenonceau, owned by the family, they put together an impressive laboratory, many of the instruments of which still exist as one of the finest surviving collections in Europe of chemical instruments from the 18th century. Rousseau even took on a student of chemistry, although he had trouble collecting his fees from him. He says, "I soon acquired the pace and even the taste for my new occupations. I became attached to chemistry. Along with Monsieur de Franqueuil, the stepson, I took several courses with Monsieur Rouelle, and for good or ill, we began to scribble on paper about that science whose elements we barely possessed. After some years of intense study, what had begun as scribbling became the 1,200-page manuscript of the Institution Chimique, Chemical Instructions." Rousseau always showed an ability to turn questions posed by other people to his own purposes. You might remember that in the second discourse, he changes the question posed by the Academy of Dijon into a different one, which he wants to answer. He does the same thing in the first discourse. He sharpened this skill while performing the tasks imposed on him by the Dupin. It's quite certain that the Institution, which is in his handwriting, is essentially his work, accomplished, to be sure, under the orders of his employers. Furthermore, the manuscript remained in Rousseau's possession after he left their employ. He carried it around for 25 years and left it to his literary executor. In sum, Rousseau began studying chemistry seriously with the leading French authority in the field in 1743 and continued to study it until at least 1749 or 1750 when he wrote the first discourse. Now I'll turn to the substance of the manuscript. The Chemical Instructions is an unfinished introductory textbook. It's divided into 4 books on the elements of bodies and their composition, on natural instruments, on artificial instruments, and on operations, which deals with chemical analysis and synthesis. Separate from the manuscript are some essays on specific topics such as copper, lead, and arsenic, which I mentioned earlier. Rousseau certainly relies on established authorities. In fact, he cites quite a number of works by major chemists. There are in particular 3 Latin sources from which he translates or paraphrases into French. He also relies on a French source and sometimes even copies from it word for pages at a time. He certainly used material taken from Rouelle's courses, his lecture notes. The numerous places where he does not borrow directly from any identifiable source are of obvious importance for determining his own views. Nonetheless, other sections can also be revealing. I'm going to talk about both Rousseau's own treatment of issues and the way he alters the discussion in his sources. Even when he might like to rely on authorities, Rousseau is faced with dilemmas, because the sources he has available frequently disagree with each other. Therefore, even when transcribing, he had to make choices about which of several competing doctrines he would follow. Both Rousseau's reliance on and his critical use of his sources is clear from the start of Book 1, which opens with an extravagant praise of the German chemist Becker and his illustrious commentator, Stahl. Rousseau says, Becker, then enlightened by the torch of experiment, dared to penetrate into the most secret roots of nature. His great intelligence, sustained by a truly philosophic genius, caused him to find the finest and most complete theory that had yet been imagined about the constitution and composition of natural bodies. This admiration does not stop Rousseau from declaring several pages later that at times our author gets tangled up in questions that are quite simple and needs to have recourse to fanciful accounts of angels to support his needlessly complicated position. Later, in his discussion of fire, he concludes that on one point, the account he favors is precisely the opposite of the doctrine of Becker. He's not a slavish follower. From the standpoint of the later history of chemistry, the most significant of Rousseau's discussions occurs in his account of fire and the phlogistic element, which played such a prominent role in Becker and Stahl, and the rejection of which was crucial for the development of the form of chemistry with which we're familiar today. A key difficulty in the phlogiston doctrine is that by arguing that the process of calcination, what was later called oxidation, involved a separation of the phlogistic element from the substance that underwent the process. It failed to account for the fact that the weight of metals could be observed to increase rather than decrease during the process. It's hard to see how removing something from a substance would leave the remaining substance heavier. This is precisely the problem to which Lavoisier turned his attention several decades later, and which led to his rejection of phlogiston theory. Rousseau admits that he inclines toward phlogiston theory, saying, "This explanation accepted today by the majority of chemists appears to be in fact the genuine ethology of calcinations." Having given this endorsement, however, he raises the problem of the increase in weight and concludes, "The reader can choose or look for a better." The point here is not that Rousseau anticipates the revolution in chemistry undertaken by Lavoisier. I'm not saying if Rousseau had stuck with chemistry, he would have been Lavoisier. It is that he was well aware of the set of issues that precipitated the revolution. What is true of Rousseau's treatment of phlogiston is also true of his treatment of the doctrine of elective affinities, which he accepts as the best available view in spite of some weaknesses. In short, while the Institutions looks like a compilation, a closer look shows that Rousseau is both selective and critical. I'll now turn to what seems to have mattered most to Rousseau in his study of chemistry, his account of what chemistry can claim to accomplish and the foundations of that claim. This account must be followed with some care, because Rousseau often begins by being very assertive and ends by being very skeptical. By following a thread on this point, I hope to give a glimpse of at least one fundamental issue with which he was engaged. That issue is the relation between natural science and natural theology. Then I will try to illustrate what is distinctive in Rousseau's approach by considering his departure from his sources. Rousseau begins the Institution with a defense of chemistry against detractors who rank it below other sciences, who regard it as identical to alchemy, or who dismiss it as merely a study of industrial processes such as making beer. Important enough, but it's not physics, right? He begins by attacking physics, generally regarded as having more dignity than chemistry. Physics, Rousseau declares, considers bodies only by their motions, their shapes, and by other similar modifications. It does not, however, tell us anything about the matter that constitutes bodies. He says it examines, so to speak, the exterior and surface. Chemistry, in contrast, goes to the essence of matter beneath the surface and looks, he says, to discover the reason for the diverse modes and accidents under which it presents itself to us. He concludes that it is certain that if there is some way to arrive at the true knowledge of nature, that is to say, of the bodies that compose it, it is by means of the analysis of them and the knowledge of the elements from which they are themselves formed that one can arrive at it. Consider what a big claim Rousseau is making. Chemistry promises to be the sole source of the true knowledge of nature, a knowledge of what substance is and how its modes and accidents work. The second chapter turns to chemistry's key question, the manner in which material principles unite to form the natural bodies we observe. Here again, Rousseau defends chemistry, this time against philosophy. He argues that while peripatetics, Cartesians, and Newtonians try to give accounts of how this union takes place, none of their contradictory accounts succeeds in explaining anything. The tendency of philosophers to present abstract systems not grounded in experiment causes him to conclude, you will learn more about it in a quarter of an hour in a chemist's lab than in your whole life among the systems of philosophers. This does not mean that chemists have been perfect in their quest for knowledge. What is needed is a combination of the systematic spirit of the philosophers and the concreteness of chemical experiments. This combination would be the true science of nature promised in the preceding chapter. Having established the dignity of chemistry, Rousseau then unobtrusively turns to difficulties in realizing its promise. The key difficulty resides in establishing the basic principles of matter. These principles are inaccessible to our sense organs and even to instruments we might use to detect them. Moreover, however many or few these principles might be, we are exposed to, he says, an infinite number of combinations of them. It now appears that even the most perfect chemistry would allow us to detect only less fundamental substances, those formed by the concourse of two or more principles, which by means of their union no longer form anything but a single whole. The underlying principles themselves remain mysterious. Thus, after the great promise of his beginning, Rousseau retreats. The resolution and composition of these secondary principles may form a science of a sort, but not the true science of nature in an unqualified sense. Book 1 treats matter or chemical elements and the compounds that come from them. Book 2 treats elements in a different sense. The difficulties Rousseau has identified in understanding matter lead him to investigate elementary processes rather than the underlying essence or substance. The goal now appears to be the imitation of natural operations rather than the knowledge of what nature is, or at most a portion of the latter for the sake of the former. One effect of this turn to process is that much of the discussion that follows is concerned with things that today's readers would expect to see in discussions of geology or climatology rather than chemistry. If we are interested in the effects of heat, the formations of solids, etc., these things may be easier to consider on a massively large scale than on an imperceptibly small one. This does not mean that Rousseau abandons the laboratory, but that he sees chemical processes as having an importance that extends beyond it. In effect, he sees the whole of the physical world, nature itself, as a sort of chemical laboratory. Once we see that Rousseau considers things like earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and climate change as matters of the operations of the elementary processes of chemistry, we get an inkling of the relevance of chemistry to the argument of part 2 of the second discourse. I'll return to this issue at the end. In book 2, Rousseau presents 3 different perspectives on nature, corresponding respectively to good sense, physics in general, and chemistry in particular. He does not treat these perspectives equally. Instead, he gives sympathetic treatments of positions which he then proceeds to criticize. Incidentally, everywhere in his writings he employs this method of appearing to approve of a commonly held position that he then goes on to demolish. This can make it easy to misunderstand him. You can quote him as approving of something which he's just tentatively approved of. Here, he begins with a treatment of common claims about the magnificence of the spectacle of nature. The admiration of most people for this spectacle is unaccompanied by understanding. Even the most competent philosophers tend to focus on very small parts. Rousseau gives as examples butterflies and houseflies. Those who try to embrace the general system of the universe invariably construct systems that fail to correspond to the facts. This tendency extends to and indeed is exemplified by the Cartesians and the Newtonians in their battles against each other. Again, Rousseau urges a middle path involving a quest for general laws that are always subject to correction by experimental data. This middle position is not novel, but it's important to observe the skepticism that accompanies it. Rousseau concludes this part of his discussion with a clear statement that shows how far he has moved from the extreme claims of his introduction. Let us believe that with the most sublime speculations and the most marvelous discoveries, we shall never succeed in knowing the true theory of nature in an evident manner. He has now completely abandoned the optimistic claims that began Book 1. We're now confronted with the claim that the true science of nature not only does not, but never will exist. Since Rousseau has retreated so much, it's surprising to see how assertive he immediately becomes. But it's on another subject. He says, an intelligent being is the active principle of all things. It is necessary to have renounced good sense to doubt this, and to give proofs for such a clear truth is visibly to waste one's time. In the midst of an introductory chemistry textbook, he has introduced a discussion of natural theology. Why? It appears that the appeal to an intelligent being who orders nature is meant to ground a science that at this point is sorely in need of grounding. Apparently, the existence of this active principle is so evident that its establishment does not depend on knowledge of a true theory of nature. All that is required is good sense. Far from depending on science, this beginning point is the presupposition of even the partial truth about nature that natural science makes available. We can hope to understand the order of nature because good sense informs us that it was established by an intelligent being. Rousseau immediately turns to a possible objection. He says, doubtless this eternal being could have produced and preserved the universe by the sole cooperation of its power and its will. But it was worthier of its wisdom to establish general laws in nature that never contradict themselves, and whose effect alone is sufficient for the preservation of the world and all it contains. A theology that stresses only the power and will of God would pose problems for any attempt to understand the laws of nature, while one that invokes only his wisdom invites us to explore the laws that preserve the world, even if we do not expect to learn the true theory of nature as a whole. Rousseau addresses divine power and will elsewhere. For now, he focuses on the natural laws that receive their warrant from his account of divine wisdom. He notes the troubling fact that the discovery of these very laws has caused some people to renounce the conclusion of good sense and to call into question divine wisdom. Could one believe that it is these very laws and the faithfulness with which they are kept that induce so many false minds to fail to recognize the legislator? Matter obeys, thus no one commands. It is impossible to lapse into atheism without making some of these bizarre arguments at every moment. Notice Rousseau says the argument is bizarre. He doesn't say it's false. Rousseau chides atheists for making use of the necessity accompanying the existence of unbreakable laws to deny the existence of a lawgiver. If unalterable necessity controls everything they claim, what need do we have for God? Having used natural theology to establish the existence of natural laws, he now seems to use these laws to support his natural theology. We know that there are laws because we know that there is a legislator, and we know that there is a legislator because we know that there are laws. Having constructed this circle, in the next paragraph, Rousseau exposes its weakness. He considers the possibility that the laws of nature might be reducible to a single one, such as Newton's principle of attraction. Whatever the case might be about this particular principle, Rousseau insists that a crucial element of any understanding of nature is some principle of motion, which he calls the universal agent. The emphasis on motion, however, is precisely what threatens natural theology. He identifies Descartes as the thinker who has relied most on a principle of motion and says, Descartes, without thinking of it, provided arms to the materialists, who, attributing a necessary motion to matter, make it into the God that created and that preserves the world. Whatever Descartes' own opinion about God might be, Rousseau claims his system invites atheism. Why is the issue of motion so important here? How does it provide an opening to the opponents of religion? Rousseau relies on mathematical laws of probability. If motion is granted to matter, it is possible to imagine the generation of an ordered universe out of chaos even without a divine legislator, if only the motion takes place over a sufficiently long period of time. Natural theology is no longer evident because the common sense view that order necessarily implies a legislator is not correct. Rousseau begins the next paragraph by asserting that we simply do not know by what principles the motions of celestial and other bodies take place. The uncertainty of all arguments on this point leads him to a new beginning point, far from the assertion of a rational natural theology based on common sense. He says, "These observations are enough to show me the point from which my researches ought to begin. I shall not torment myself in wishing to find out why the stars roll in their orbits. I shall not attempt either to relate the formation of plants and animals to the principles of mechanics or hydrostatics. And I shall not imitate that insane chemist who dared to undertake to make a man by the operations of his art." Note that Rousseau renounces both natural theology and a dogmatic materialist account of life. Instead, he focuses on the world of immediate experience, which he argues manifestly is preserved by the operation of chemical activities, the operation of climate, as well as digestions, dissolutions, filtrations, fermentations, calcinations, and all the operations that chemistry does nothing but imitate. In short, he recommends a study of basic chemical processes shorn of any pretense to an ultimate knowledge of nature and unconnected with natural theology. This is a very modest and skeptical science. While this is the most extended discussion of the relation between science and rational natural religion in the institutions, it is not the only one. In what I've just been discussing, Rousseau does not rely on any sources. The source for the material in the next chapter is the Dutch chemist Herman Boerhaave, whom Rousseau follows in appealing to theology as the foundation of scientific knowledge. Such appeals are hardly unique to Boerhaave in 18th century chemical works, although they are especially frequent in his work. As he explains in his dedication of his book on chemistry to his brother, he began his study of chemistry with a theological interest, but then became interested in medicine. His brother had gone in the opposite direction. The careers of the Boerhaave brothers, then, illustrate the mutual support and interchange of natural theology and science, precisely the position that Rousseau has come to question. I want to follow the details of Rousseau's use of and departure from Boerhaave closely. I apologize for so much detail about a text you don't know. The issue of theology returns in Rousseau's discussion of heat and cold, discussion that relies on Boerhaave. After a process of elimination, he defines these not as material substances, fire and its absence, but principles of rarefaction and density of bodies. Fire is an elementary process. Heat, fire is heat, not a material element. He adds, "It is by these admirable properties that the author of nature maintains it in a continuous motion. The course of the sun, the direction of its rays, the clouds it lifts up, the winds it stirs up, and 1,000 other particular causes change at every moment the temperature of the air in all the climates of the world. The degree of warmth is never the same in two successive instants in the same place, and it is by that continuous succession that life and movement are preserved in all things." Rousseau claims that incessant motion, which produces a condition that is never the same in two successive instants in the same place, is the necessary condition for the preservation of life. And he attributes the harmony between this motion and the preservation of life to the author of nature. His discussion departs from Boerhaave's only by admitting the qualification most knowing, sapientissimus, in the description of the author of nature. Boerhaave's author of nature is knowing, Rousseau's might not be. he has deleted the emphasis upon divine wisdom as the guiding force of nature in favor of simple motion. So far, we don't have anything very striking, but note that Rousseau does make changes in his source. Rousseau's ultimate view of this position appears in a passage in the final chapter in Book 2. In discussing the idea of an imperceptible elemental earth underlying all the different substances our senses experience, he carefully distinguishes this element from its manifestations. These manifestations occur in the chemical compounds we experience, such as sand, which performs the function of filtering and dispersing water, without which the earth would no longer produce anything and would soon let the entire human race perish from hunger and misery. He concludes this discussion in Book 2 saying, "The terrestrial mass upon which we walk is an unformed assemblage and a sort of chaos of all natural bodies. Thus, in attaching to earth, properly speaking, the idea that we have given to it, one will easily know that nature does not offer to our eyes an idea that has all the homogeneity which this idea assumes. It does not leave its instruments idle this way. The decomposition of one body is immediately followed by the conformation of another. It is from this infinite number of combinations ceaselessly destroyed and begun again that the harmony of this universe is born." One could regard these remarks as supporting an idea of divine providence. Humble sand is divinely ordained in order to filter our water for us. Rousseau does not take this step. He refers to the earth as a chaos and claims that the harmony comes from an infinite number of combinations ceaselessly destroyed and begun again. That this harmony happens to coincide with human survival could simply be the result of a randomly generated order of the world arising out of a long and random sequence of combinations. Moreover, the very infiniteness of the number of possible combinations suggests that the harmony that we observe now may well be transient. The passage indicates a correspondence between human survival and a condition brought about by chance rather than providence. That Rousseau's failure to refer to God in this passage is quite deliberate is indicated by the fact that Boerhaave does not make the same omission in his corresponding passage. While Rousseau says that the apparently useless sand, in fact, has a great importance in the system of nature, Boerhaave attributes this importance to an intentional action of the author of nature. Moreover, unlike Rousseau, Boerhaave does not refer to an infinite number of combinations when discussing the destruction and recommencement that takes place in nature. Rousseau then tacitly turns away from the providentialist account given by Boerhaave to one in which order comes out of chaos merely through an infinite number of different combinations. In sum, while some passages of the institutions accept a rational natural theology with a general providence, these passages occur when Rousseau follows his source most submissively. His alterations of Boerhaave and passages not relying on any source move in a different direction. Rousseau drops references to a divinity and, at least in some cases, replaces them with the operations of chance over a sufficiently long period of time. As we have seen, for Boerhaave and the parts of the institutions drawn from him, natural religion and science are mutual supports. From the perspective of natural religion, science is a support against atheism in that it suggests that the orderliness of nature is the result of divine wisdom. Some parts of the institution suggest that the inverse is also true. That is, rational natural religion is an important support of science against a revealed religion that places greater emphasis on divine will and power than on divine wisdom. Without that support, one cannot be sure that the laws of nature necessarily hold. To the extent that Rousseau departs from this circle of mutual reinforcement, his position is necessarily a skeptical one. As I have said, in Rousseau's preliminary account of the obviousness of rational natural religion, stressing the wisdom and beneficence of the author of nature, an account which he proceeds to call into question, he raises the possibility that the world could be based on a constant exercise of God's power and will rather than on rational natural laws. He does not elaborate on this possibility in a systematic way, but two passages do bear on it. These discuss the possibility of God changing the ordinary course of nature, performing a miracle. The first occurs in Book 1, Chapter 1, in the discussion of material principles. In the discussion of the question of the infinite divisibility of matter, Rousseau argues that disputes over the infinite divisibility are merely quibbles over phraseology, and that serious defenders of this hypothesis could be pressed by a version of Zeno's paradox into conceding that their position would lead to the denial that matter even exists. We can divide it right out of existence. He even paraphrases a passage from Boerhaave referring to a principle of physical indivisibility infused into fundamental corpuscles by the creator God who does all things. While Rousseau's quotation appears to endorse Boerhaave's position, unlike Boerhaave, he adds that by means of the virtual division of atoms into parts, God could cut each atom in two if he judged it appropriate. An omnipotent God not only establishes the naturally indivisible, but could also divide it. While Boerhaave emphasizes the rational limits God imposes upon nature and himself, Rousseau adds the possibility of an incomprehensible divine power breaking these limits. The other passage occurs in the discussion of heat. The fundamental characteristic of heat is its ability to liquefy almost all bodies. This discussion follows Boerhaave closely. Rousseau, however, elaborates on the claim that fire can melt anything, turning even refractory stones into glass. He adds, if one could increase its degree as one chooses, nothing would resist it. And if the final incineration is not a mythical figure of speech, it must not be imagined that it would destroy and annihilate the world, but as numerous ancient philosophers believed, it will change it into a mass of glass, unless God gives this avenging fire properties that this element does not have today. At the end of the world, the earth and all it contains will be turned into a ball of glass. For once, Rousseau's reference to God is not taken from Boerhaave. Rousseau's primary intention here is to side with the numerous ancient philosophers and against alchemists who see fire as a candidate in their quest for a universal solvent. Fire cannot naturally become hot enough to destroy everything. In this, Rousseau stands with Boerhaave. Nonetheless, his additional mention of the possibility that a vengeful God could increase the power of fire beyond its natural limits indicates the possibility of a divinity that stands altogether outside of the rational order of nature. The vengeful divinity that would unleash the all-consuming fire is one characterized by power and will rather than wisdom and beneficence. Let me summarize. Rousseau's departures from Boerhaave show that while writing The Institutions, he was concerned with a set of issues involving atheism, rational natural religion, revealed religion that departs from natural religion, and the foundations of natural science. There is evidence of this external to, but contemporaneous with the Institutions. This evidence concerns Rousseau's reflections on the questions of whether the structure of the world is evidence of a divine legislator, or whether it could be the product of random events acting over a sufficiently long period of time. During the period in which he was studying chemistry and writing his Institutions, Rousseau's friendship with Denis Diderot, most famous as the editor of the Encyclopedia, was at its peak. During this period, they dined together at least once a week and discussed their literary projects together. Rousseau drafted the first number of a periodical the two planned to start, which expresses a playful skepticism about physics or natural science in general, comparable to some of the passages of the Institutions. I'll mention in passing that one of my former graduate students, a St. John's graduate, who read this draft of a pamphlet, suggested that its proper title should be The Hipster. Rousseau closes Book 7 of the Confessions, the book in which he discusses his work on chemistry, with an account of Diderot's imprisonment after the publication of his work, The Letter on the Blind for the Benefit of Those Who See, in 1749. In the final paragraph of Book 7, he explains the philosophical thoughts, an earlier book by Diderot, had attracted some troubles onto him, which had no consequences at all. It was not the same with The Letter on the Blind, which had nothing reprehensible. This reference to the philosophical thoughts is important. This work did in fact attract troubles for Diderot, although it did not land him in jail yet. The book was condemned by the Parliament of Paris, which characterized it as presenting to restless and reckless spirits the venom of the most criminal opinions that the depravity of human reason is capable of. Now that would be the blurb on the front of the book. This work was written in April 1746, published in June, and condemned in July. In short, its composition, publication, and condemnation occurred as Rousseau was becoming most absorbed in chemistry. Rousseau frequently commented on his reaction to the philosophical thoughts. In particular, he refers to the 21st of Diderot's 62 Thoughts. Elsewhere, Diderot defends skepticism and suggests that it is compatible with Christianity, or at least natural religion. Here, however, he treats atheism more sympathetically. The thought begins, I open the notebooks of a famous professor, and I read, atheists, I grant you that motion is essential to matter. What do you conclude from that? That the world results from the fortuitous throw of the atoms? I would just as much like for you to tell me that Homer's Iliad or Voltaire's Henriade is a result of the fortuitous throws of characters. Having quoted the famous professor, Diderot cautions, I will be careful about making this argument to an atheist. This comparison would give him no trouble. In accordance with the laws of the analysis of lots, he would say to me, I should not be surprised that a thing happens as long as it is possible, and that the difficulty of the event is compensated for by the quantity of throws. What would be repugnant to reason would be the failure of not merely one, but an infinite number of admirable arrangements to arise with an infinite number of throws. In short, once it is granted that motion is intrinsic to matter, the laws of probability make the establishment of an ordered universe out of chaos certain. This is a stronger version of the argument, or a stronger claim, than we have seen Rousseau using in the Institutions. But it's a similar argument. It's a stronger claim because Rousseau's claim that an unknown number of elementary principles can generate an infinite number of compounds, a possibility not considered by Diderot, who seems to assume a finite number of compounds, lessens the force of the argument without disposing of it altogether. Rousseau's judgment appears to be that Diderot cannot prove that the orderly world would necessarily come into being through chance, but that the mere possibility that it could come into being this way would destroy one of the pillars of natural theology, the argument that the existence of order proves the existence of a divine legislator. Rousseau's most significant discussion of this thought occurs in a draft of his letter to Voltaire of August 1756, shortly after publication of the Second Discourse. In addressing arguments over the existence of God, he says that neither the pro nor the con seems to me demonstrated on this point by the lights of reason. He then adds, I remember that what struck me most forcefully in my whole life on the fortuitous arrangement of the universe is the 21st philosophical thought, where is shown by the laws of analysis of chance that when the quantity of throws is infinite, the difficulty of the event is more than sufficiently compensated by the multiplicity of the throws, and that consequently the mind ought to be more astonished by the hypothetical continuation of chaos than by the real birth of the universe. This is, while assuming motion necessary, what has never been said with more force to my mind on this dispute. Thus, immediately after denying that the lights of reason can settle this question, and before concluding that the presupposition of this argument cannot be known for sure, Rousseau insists that Diderot's is the strongest argument he has ever seen. He does go on to say that sentiment persuades him that the manifest order of the world is not the result of chance, but he also concedes that this sentiment might be called prejudice. Rousseau frequently returned to the argument of the 21st thought, both tacitly and explicitly. In no case does he reject it on rational grounds. The importance that Rousseau attributed to Diderot's argument is clear. One part of the significance of the Institutions chimiques is that at a time very close to the publication of the philosophical thoughts, it contains Rousseau's first treatment of Diderot's argument and the consequences that follow from it. It should be stressed, however, that engagement with the issue does not necessarily mean that Rousseau settles the questions to his own satisfaction then. With such an early work, one must not look for more than it has to offer. But what it does have to offer is an indication of a crucial question or set of questions that concerned Rousseau just before he had his illumination that launched his literary career. I'll conclude by mentioning a way the issues addressed in the Institutions chimiques Open Perspectives on the Second Discourse. Here, Rousseau uses a variant of Diderot's argument to undermine the idea of natural sociability of humans rather than natural theology, although the two ideas are closely related, and that the ideas about a providential God working through nature are likely to be connected with strong notions about natural sociability. Those of you who've been studying the Second Discourse remember that Rousseau closes part one of the discourse with the claim that he has demonstrated first that inequality is barely perceptible in the state of nature, and second, that the faculties whose development is required for sociability could never develop by themselves. The issue to which he must turn in part two, then, is how this apparently stable condition could turn into the extremely different one we observe today. How can we get from the pure state of nature to the radically different social state? Students ask this all the time. If our social faculties could not develop by themselves, what did make them develop? Rousseau concedes that the details of any account of how the changes took place are conjectural, but insists that any successful account must involve a number of factors, among which are, he says, reflections concerning the ways in which the lapse of time compensates for the slight probability of events, concerning the surprising power of very trivial causes when they act without interruption. His effort in part two of the discourse is to show how very trivial causes external to human nature, they may not seem trivial to us, but to nature they are, causes such as earthquakes, floods, small changes in climate, can interact with human nature, with its distinctive faculty of perfectibility, to bring about enormous social changes. Changes in the physical environment, which I have suggested Rousseau understands as belonging to the province of chemical processes of heating, solidification, liquefaction, and rarefaction, are what induce changes in social relations. Things that we think of as our natural faculties develop under the pressure of external forces rather than from a natural internal development. As Rousseau put it in defending the argument of the discourse, the state of society is derived from the nature of the human race, not immediately, but only, as I have proved, with the help of certain external circumstances that may or may not happen, or at least occur sooner or later and consequently speed up or slow down the progress. We do not need to read the 1,208 pages of the Institution chimique to understand the argument that Rousseau is making here or its force. Nevertheless, the connections that Rousseau makes in the Institution among this argument, his objections to natural theology, and his account of the solidity or lack of solidity of the foundations of natural science help to show us that his very distinctive answers to questions posed by others derive from a deeper set of questions that he had earlier posed to himself.